We will be starting the webinar in approximately 2 minutes. As is our tradition with this series, please find your chat box at the bottom and let us know where you're coming from. And so there we go. First one. Welcome, Logan from Sunbury, Ohio. Bienvenidos, Lima, Peru. Welcome, Texas. Moscow, Pennsylvania.
Canada.
Anna, California. Excuse me, Canadians. Coming in fast. Wow, we have, I think, 1,300 registered today. It is election day, so we'll see if everybody can make it. We didn't think that one completely through, I'll be honest. When we plan these out well in advance, we forget about some of those things. But welcome, everybody, to the Tree Fund webinar series. As you join us, let us know where you're coming from. And I see everybody coming in. Bienvenidos, Colombia. I'll be headed down there in a few weeks to present. Looking forward to it. Welcome, Cape Cod, Saskatchewan, Minnesota, Los Angeles. Wonderful to see everybody joining us on this beautiful Tuesday. And Heath, I think you already hit the recording button, correct?
Yeah, we are recording.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Tree Fund webinar series. My clock is reading 12 Central. I know people are joining from around the globe from various time zones, so thank you for being here and supporting the Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I work with Auburn University, and we have the pleasure of being a partner and host in the Tree Fund webinar series. We have a fantastic webinar planned for you today with two speakers who are going to be talking about tree-caused outages, what we know and what we have learned. We also have a special guest who is going to be providing an introduction. Before I turn it over to my co-host, Heath Hupke, I would just like to remind everybody on a couple of things. When we get ready to do the Q&A section with the time we have left at the webinar, please use the Q&A function. The chat is a great place for y'all to communicate amongst yourself, but if there's a question you want us to bring to the attention of the speakers, please put that in the Q&A box. I would also remind everybody on our CEU policy. The way CEUs work with the Tree Fund webinar series is that when you registered, we ask for your name and your certification number. And then we will look at today's attendance records. And for those that attended today, we will send your CEU information directly to ISA on your behalf. And so that is the way ISA has asked us to run this webinar series, because it is so large that we don't do the self-reporting for this webinar series. So that'll be the only introduction and comments I make. At this point now, I would like to introduce Heath Hupke, who is not new to anybody that's on the Tree Fund webinar series. He is my co-host and the person that you all hear from most often when you're either doing CEUs or getting emails about this webinar series. So Heath, I will turn the virtual floor over to you.
Oh, thank you, Bo, and thank you everybody for attending again. We will be submitting your ISA CEUs on your behalf. It does take some time, as you can see. We already have over 750 people in here, so there's a lot to go through. But as long as you registered properly, we've got all of your information, and we'll let you know when those CEUs are submitted and approved on your behalf. So thank you again for coming. I guess before we look at some of our 2024 webinars, I do just want to remind everybody here in the United States, it is election day, so I hope that you've all done your civic duty. But as a reminder, we do have a chat function, and we ask that you refrain from discourse of politicalness in our chat. We are here to learn and talk about our trees and how we can take care of them in this world. So we're asking that we try to refrain from using the chat function in that way. And as Bo already said, we do have a Q&A function. It might look different as it has in the past. I have found my Q&A function in the little more tablet at the bottom. So if you're not seeing your Q&A, if you click more, you will see it in that area. So again, we've got one more after today, we still have one more Tree Fund webinar series lined up for 2024 on Tuesday, December 17th, again at this time, noon Central Standard Time. It is the biocarb for tree growth and water quality, exploring potential in urban and disturbed soils with Dr. Rebecca Abney and Julia Campbell. So here probably in about a week, I think we'll be able to have that registration open and available for all of you. You can find it on our upcoming scheduled Tree Fund webpage. And then obviously, I think most of you, we now have your email, so you will be getting reminders in your email box as well for that upcoming webinar. And we have some webinars already lined up for the early parts of 2025 in March, April, and May with Dr. Huad Guan, Dr. Carolyn Mahan, and Maisha Clark and Stephanie Cadaval. So we hope that as the year continues, we will be adding more. I've already got somebody lined up for November, December, depending on how that schedule works. So we will continuously be providing Tree Fund webinars, which is really highlighting a lot of what Tree Fund does as we are giving grants and research and what's coming around the horizon. So we want to make sure that we offer this opportunity for our researchers and for you to both receive and give that information. And Tree Fund is a nonprofit. So for those that are able, willing to donate and give your funds to support this free service that we provide, if you find this helpful and educational, we welcome support for ongoing research and education that Tree Fund is able to provide for you all. We appreciate every dollar that's ever come in, and we appreciate any support that we have. And next, I would like to introduce Dennis Fallon with UAA. Dennis is a utility arborist and executive director of the Utility Arborist Association. Prior to his current role, he was responsible for leading vegetation management programs across several upper Midwest USA states on behalf of a large investor-owned utility. He's also been an adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, where he facilitated the Utility Vegetation Management Certificate Program, a combined effort of the UAA and Utility Vegetation Management Association. Mr. Fallon has an undergraduate degree in urban and community forestry and a master's degree in forestry from the University of Minnesota, St. Paul, and is currently serving as vice president of the college's Alumni Society Board. Mr. Fallon?
Thank you, Heath. Appreciate that. It's an honor to be here today with everyone. The Utility Arborist Association and the Tree Fund created the Utility Arborist Research Fund about 15 years ago. So we're coming up on a significant milestone with that, and another significant milestone associated with that fund is we're rapidly approaching the point where the fund's principal amount has paid out as much as the endowment. So we're working to fund as many projects as we can. The Utility Arborist Research Fund is derived to finance the work of real importance and benefit to the utility vegetation management professionals. Projects like this really do a nice job to leverage an opportunity moving forward and are a result of great generosity and foresight. So appreciate everybody who's made it possible for us to support researchers and research like we're going to talk about here today. So I get the opportunity to introduce a couple of friends of mine, which is always an opportunity, which is always fun. So without further delay, Greg Dahle is a professor at West Virginia University, where he teaches and researches how trees grow and survive environmental loads. Greg was practicing arborist in California, working with municipal, commercial, and utility clients. He's an ISA board certified master arborist, qualified tree risk assessor, as well as a track instructor. Cindy Devlin Musick has spent her entire career in the utility vegetation management space, almost immediately after finishing her undergraduate degree in forestry at West Virginia University. First, she worked with Pepco, based in Washington, D.C., and then is now with Rappahannock Electric Cooperative, based in Fredericksburg, Virginia. She did have a short stint with the Hawaiian Electric Co-op in Honolulu. She's a licensed forester in Maryland and has been a certified arborist and utility arborist for over 20 years. And Cindy's also recently been elected to the Utility Arborist Association's Board of Directors. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Cindy and Greg. Thank you for having me.
Okay, there we go. All right, thanks so much, Dennis. And thank you to the Utility Arborist Research Fund for having us today. We really appreciate it. And so what we're going to talk about today is exactly what's on the screen here. What we know about tree-caused outages and what we've learned. And I just want to also thank Dr. Greg Dahle, who has been so patient with me the last 5 years working together while we have moved through this data collection and writing, and we're to the point now that we're ready to publish about it. So let's see how I can move the slide here. I should be sharing.
Try arrow down.
There we go. Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to be talking about. Bear with me. I'm not a presenter. Normally, I'm running a department at a small electric co-op in Virginia. So if I stumble on my words or something doesn't sound right, it's because I don't do this every day. So we're going to talk about the history and the background. We're going to talk about why this matters, why this mission of preventing outages, power outages due to trees matters in the grand scheme of things. Dr. Dahle is going to present about tree risk and risk assessment, and just shameless plug, if you have not had the opportunity to go to one of his certification courses or recertification courses, here's the expert, one of them right here. We're going to talk about mitigation by utilities. What do we do with this massive problem? How do we try to prevent things? And then we're going to talk about the research that was conducted, what we learned about tree-caused outages in Virginia at our utility. And then last but not least, but probably most important to me, is how do we use this data? How is it going to help us in the future, and how is it going to help the industry at large? So 10,000 foot view. The leading cause of power outages east of the Mississippi is trees. You can see that, I think it looks like a maple to me. Portion of it's dead. Over on the far right of that picture, you can see a transformer pole and a pole. When trees fail, it costs money. When trees fail, it's very expensive. And the leading cause of outages, at least in our service territory and most of the eastern part of the United States, are trees. So why does this matter? If you use a cell phone, if you have ever worked from home, as some of us are doing frequently now, if you have children that had to be educated during COVID using a computer screen, all of us are connected because of this device that we turned on today, and we were able to flip the switch and it just came on. If you drive an electric car, if you have light bulbs in your house, it matters to every aspect of our lives. So the Utility Arborist Research Fund supported this research. We wrote a grant 5 years ago, and this is why. This slide over here on the right-hand side shows the leading causes of power outages at my utility. And right at the top of the list there are trees outside the power line easement, outside the right-of-way. In my case, that's about 40 feet of property that we have the right to exist, poles and wires. But these trees are from outside of that. That's a big deal. Number two is squirrels. I can't do anything about squirrels. We love them all anyway. Cause 3 and 4 are equipment failures. Cause 5 are tree limbs. Very small compared to trees outside the right-of-way, but still a cause. And then a lesser extent, dead trees. Again, outside of that right-of-way easement. And then birds and lightning, which we're not going to talk about today. So here is your break, your humor break for today. So I have a great vendor that produced a calendar that was just geared towards utility arborists, and this was this month's picture. And it's just a play on if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And this says, if a tree falls on your line, it makes an expensive sound. So just a little break from a little stressful day. So again, big picture stuff. We're talking about a lot of money that's spent annually. In 2021, $8 billion with a B dollars were spent on utility vegetation management in the United States. That does not count what was spent around the world. That is expected to go up to close to 40 billion by 2029. That's an enormous number, $40 billion. Well, why is it so expensive? The pieces of equipment that you see here are anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000 each. When you look at the people that are operating this equipment, they're highly trained. They have a lot of training in safety, electrical hazardous awareness. And these folks are the tip of the spear when it comes to restoring power outages. In order for line mechanics, line workers to come in and fix the lines when a tree comes over from what you see outside that right of way, you need a tree crew to get the trees out of the way so that work can be done safely and securely. Just in the United States alone, we have about 160,000 miles of transmission lines and millions of miles of power distribution lines. That's where this number comes from. That's why it's so expensive. And again, there's different tools in the toolbox. There's different types of saws and mechanical equipment and chainsaws and chippers you have to clean up after yourself. And in rare cases, we sometimes actually use a helicopter to get into areas that are remote and inaccessible for safety. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dahle.
Thank you, Cindy. Folks, I wanted to spend a couple minutes in our presentation today talking about tree risk and tree risk assessment and how I see that plays out in the utility sector. Before I do, Dennis and I have been conversing over the past year or two about my philosophy about urban forestry. And as an urban forester, I have always seen utility as part of urban forestry. So a shameless plug for myself, when we look at what urban forestry is in the urban forest, looking at one quote, it's all the woody vegetation in the environs of populated places, from the tiniest of village to the largest of cities. And so urban foresters manage large tracts of trees in where we live, work, and play. And from my standpoint, a utility arborist is really a utility urban forester because they are managing across a whole, in this case for Cindy's utility, across the whole part of central and northern Virginia, from the east to the west, but also within a big city or something to that extent. So I think of what we do as utility urban forestries as paramount to how we live, work, and play. This elm tree that you see in the top right is growing in and around power lines, and maintaining that so it doesn't fall over and keeps our power on so that we can charge our cell phone is, I think, very important. Cindy, slide, please. So tree risk assessment is what I am trying to talk about today. Cindy, could you advance the slide? So tree risk assessment, as we wait for the slide to move forward, is a discussion of how we look at the likelihood of failure of a tree against the likelihood that it might impact a power line or any object that we're concerned with, and the list of the potential consequences for that. So ISA came out with their first BMPs, Best Management Practices for Tree Risk Assessment, a couple decades ago now, and it lays out how we can look at an individual tree and assess its likelihood of failure, its likelihood of impact, and the consequences. Is it going to hurt a car, fall into a house? Or in this case, this tree is falling, or about falling over a power line, a three-phase distribution line. And about 4 years ago, John Goodfellow, with the help of the UAA, took that BMP, best management practices, and applied it to the utility sector. Instead of looking at an individual tree, we're looking at a collection of trees across a system-wide approach of how can we look at the likelihood of failure, likelihood of impact, and the consequences. Today's talk, we're going to spend most of the time with Cindy's research looking at the likelihood of failure. Slide, please, Cindy. And the way, I'm not going to spend a lot of time today going over these, the BMPs and how to use these tables, but I wanted to present to you all, if you're not familiar with the tree risk assessment, how you can at least look at this really quickly. Everyone's available worldwide to buy the BMPs, and they're written so well, whether it be utility or the tradition or the main BMPs, they're written fairly well that we can all learn to apply them, or you can become track qualified. So we look on the left side of the top table, table 1, you look at the likelihood of the failure, and you rate it as improbable, possible, probable, imminent. And then you look at the likelihood at that failure, potential failure could impact your target of concern. For what we're looking at today, we're looking at power lines. It's either very low, low, medium, or high. And if you said that's the medium likelihood of impact and a probable likelihood of failure, that intersection of that is somewhat likely. We take somewhat likely to the second table, the risk rating matrix table, and we bring that over on the left side of table 2, and we rate the consequences as negligible, minor, significant, or severe. And we use that intersection of somewhat likely and let's say significant, and we say the risk for that tree failure is moderate. And again, we can do this around our backyards, city streets, around buildings, or around power lines. Slide, please. And so how do we categorize likelihood of impact? Again, it's very low. The tree in the top left of those 4 trees, if that tree were to fail, it is almost certainly going to fail away from the power lines. So we would call that likelihood of impact very low. The tree in the top center, growing right next to the power lines, it's likely to fall away from the power line, but there's a low chance that likelihood that it could fall into the power line. Down below that, the tree that has been V-trimmed out, that is probably a medium likelihood of failure because it could fall, part of it could fall straight down, but part of it could fall into the power line. So we'd call that maybe a medium. And the tree on the right is hard to see, but the tree that is leaning to its right, it is most certainly going to fall to the right. It's actually been marked to be removed along the utility line, and you cannot really see it, but there's a distribution line on the right side of the road. So if that tree were to fall, it's going to impact the distribution line. Slide, please. So when we look at likelihood of failure, this is how likely is it that tree is going to fail. We, in the newest versions of the BMPs, both the utilities and the regular BMPs for tree risk assessment, we address trees by normal weather, extreme weather, and abnormally extreme weather. So the normal weather is the weather that we expect in any given location on a 30-year average. That would be a standard wind of, in your location, maybe 20, 30 miles per hour, a normal storm, one that we see regularly over the multiple times a year. Extreme weathers are things that we do not generally expect to see within the time frame. So when we do tree risk assessment, we look at the time frame. How long are we assessing that tree for its likelihood of failure? And that would generally, in the urban sector, whether it's utility urban forestry or commercial or residential urban forestry, we might look at that as let's say a 2 to 5 year time frame. So within that 3 or 5 years, we don't expect to see severe thunderstorms in 2 or 3 years, or freezing rain or straight line winds. While they happen, they're not something that happens generally within that shorter time frame. The abnormally extreme weather, these are the unpredictable, infrequent things like tornadoes, derechos, hurricanes and ice storms. Those are difficult, if impossible, to manage for, and extreme weather can be difficult to manage for. Slide, please. So I'm going to define the likelihood of failure because I think it's pertinent to Cindy's research. So improbable likelihood of failure. This is a tree that's not likely to fail during normal and may not even fail during extreme weather events. Both these trees are healthy. Yes, the tree on the left has maybe a frost crack or a growth crack on it, but both trees we expect to be here for many years. So they're not likely to fail. Improbable likelihood of failure. Slide. A possible likelihood of failure is a failure that we may expect to see in extreme weathers, and it may fail during normal weather conditions. Having trouble with the slides right now, it looks like.
Doing the exact same thing with a different result. There we go.
There we go. So possible, it may fail during extreme weathers, but it's unlikely during normal weather. The tree on the right has been lightning struck just recently. It's still a reasonably healthy tree. We don't expect it in 3 to 5 years to fail, but it might fail during extreme weather. And the tree on the left, we could possibly expect that to fail during normal weathers, but it's not likely. So let's see if we can try another slide advance. The likelihood of failure is probable when it's expected to fail under normal weather conditions. So in these cases, both these trees are dead. The tree on the left, it's dead and over a power line. So we can expect under normal weather conditions, branches or maybe the whole tree uprooting. The tree on the right, you can see sapwood rot. So this is a tree that at any time we'd expect some of that tree to start falling apart. So that's a probable. And
Not
then it's
throw in with this one, if I may, that the
Please.
tree on the left is over some pack cable, pre-assembled aerial cable, and it's heavy. So when this tree fails, it's going to break multiple poles.
So that ties into when we get to the consequences, we're going to have much higher consequences. It's take a lot longer to repair this outage because of the failure is going to break multiple poles that need to be reset and the lines need to be restrung. All right, so let's go to imminent, I believe is the next slide. So imminent is when the trees are actively failing or we expect those trees to fail in the very near future. So in both these cases, these trees on the left, you can see the hole in the soil. This tree is in the process of uprooting, and the tree on the right has already started to fail and it's being held up by a smaller tree that we don't see in the picture. So I expect that tree under normal weather conditions to finish the failure at any point. So if we move on to consequences, so slide. Consequences in the utility sector from the utility tree risk assessments can be either direct, damaging the conductors and the equipment, such as what Cindy just said with the PECs, or indirect, that it could cause a power outage, a business can't operate, or possibly a hospital is now without power and having to run on backup generator. So let's look at a few of those consequences really quickly. So slide. So the two on this slide that we want to talk about is negligible and minor. But before I do, I want to spend a quick second discussing a general distribution power line and the power system in general. Going from the top left off to the right, we see that transmission line. In the US, those transmission lines are often from 60 to 500 kV. This is an old one. That's maybe it should be 100 to 500 kV. They come down into a distribution substation that steps the voltage of the power down to stuff that we can distribute between the rural areas or to your front yard or in the city. And so everything after that substation is distribution. And we see that we have a recloser, a switch as we go down the power line, just like your circuit breaker. We have that circuit that is broken up into different segments so that if we have a power outage, we limit the amount of customers. In this case, we're seeing customers could be as high as 4,000 to 7,000 customers. So we try to set it up in a way that not all of them would lose power at the same time. So a negligible consequence is, let's say this picture on the top right, the tree is growing and brushing into the power, and we're seeing what's like a brownout. Your house is just, you're receiving a shortage every once in a while and your lights flicker. So that would be a negligible consequence. The minor is, let's say a fuse is broken and the utility has to come in and replace the fuse. Not overly expensive, fairly easy to do, and not a lot of time. Slide, please. The other two, the top two consequences are significant and severe. So if we lose a power line such as that section or a sectionalizer, that power equipment, we might lose, a few thousand or 1,000 or 2,000 of those customers. So that's going to be a significant outage that may incur, depending on how long it is, some fines and penalties to university. We also would have severe if we lose the whole circuit, or if it's before that first recloser. This first recloser would be the first device downline, and this would be the high reliability zone that Cindy is going to speak of in a few seconds. One more slide, I think, for me, Cindy. So what I want to do is I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy. What we are trying to do with her research is, first of all, this is her idea. She came to me and wanted to stay working as a utility arborist, utility urban forester, and also pursue her doctorate. So her research is very practical. It's meaningful to her and any utility manager across the country and certainly across the world. So what we're looking at is, how do tree caused outages occur? What causes a tree to fail? So we're trying to get a better handle on that likelihood of failure. And with that, Cindy, I'll turn it over to you.
Deep breath. Hopefully this is going to work for me. Okay, so where are we? We are in the United States of America, and there's Virginia over on the eastern part of the United States. And if you look across kind of the middle section of Virginia, where that star is our capital in Richmond, and just north of there is the 22 counties that my cooperative serves. And just a plug about electric cooperatives. They are member-owned. They are not for profit. Their sole purpose is to deliver power reliably and at a reasonable cost to our members. So at the end of the day, if we have any funds left over from maintenance and upkeep and so forth, it goes back to our members. Kind of a different business model. So here again is our service territory. If you've been on the East Coast of the United States, you'll recognize that I-95 that kind of goes from Miami to Maine and cuts right through the middle of our service territory. That yellow area is the part of Virginia that this cooperative serves. So here was our problem to solve. Why are trees likely to fail? It's no big surprise, when you turn on any news station, when there's high winds, or there's a hurricane, or there's tornadoes or thunderstorms even. Saturated soils and trees fail. And normally we kind of expect a certain amount of that, but a lot of trees fail on a blue sky. We call them bluebird days. And so we collected data from all of that, 32 months worth, from June 2020, this is how we did COVID, and through February of 2023. So this included 77 substations out of the 100 that we have had at the time, 176 out of the approximately 300 circuits. And we collected over 1,200 records by walking up to a tree failure and taking a look at it. Of those, about 844 were full, complete, 100% filled out data. So those are the ones we used for this data set. And we used categorical data analysis, chi-squared tests, and Cochrane-Mentel-Hansel using JUMP and SAS. And overall, the p-values, the alpha, were much less than 0.0005. So very statistically significant. So how do we collect the data? Well, this is where I get to brag a bit. I work with an amazing team. I have 9 certified arborists on staff, and they were the primary data collectors along with myself. They're all ISA certified arborists. Most of them are also utility certified arborists. We'll see a picture of them at the very end. And 9 out of 9 are also licensed drone pilots. So they are talented, educated, smart individuals. And they looked at these outages, power outages post-mortem. So after the tree failed, after the limb failed, what have you. And that ranged from any time from 2 days to 2 weeks. I think we averaged usually a week to 2. Initially, our analytics company, it's now an analytics company. At the time, it was just a department, but we have a company now called Brillet that's a subsidiary, developed an application for us just to collect tree caused outage data. And then this later segued into a web portal, and we're able to collect that data now, even if we don't have connectivity. And we are in between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, which is not necessarily rural too much anymore, but we often have a lack of cell signal. So the other thing that we collected every time was at the base of the tree, a let and a long. And that's a whole different data set that we're not going to really talk about too much today. That's another paper that Dr. Dahle and I are writing together, along with some GIS support from WVU and some drones. So again, this is kind of what the output, if you will, from the data collection, and 844 of those records over 2.5 years. We have that flowing into a Power BI database, and that is such a powerful application in terms of visually depicting stats. And the latest update to that was just to include a picture and a map. And so we've started to take a lot of that and map it with a lot of geographic information and soil types and slope and prevailing winds and all kinds of other different things. But that's, again, paper B, if you will. So let's talk about what we found. Overwhelmingly, and let me just kind of give you a little geography here, what you're looking at. So in order to make all of this data just very simple to use and simple to look at, we color coded it. So green is branches because it's at the top of the tree, yellow is trunk, it's at the middle of the tree, and roots are at the bottom, so they're brown. So that's what you're looking at overall. And then we wanted to start out very broad. So we looked at, hardwoods versus softwoods. Overwhelmingly, most of the failures that we saw were trunk failures. 67% almost on softwoods or pines. We have a variety of softwoods in our service territory, anything from hemlock in the western area to white pines. Prevalence of Virginia pines in the central part of our territory, and the same on the eastern part. That was surprising to us. We expected a higher percentage of branch failures with pines. And I'm not sure if that was because, a big chunk of them maybe were cedars, so they're small enough, they're not gonna, even impact the line. Or they were just of the size, and anecdotally, we do see a lot of Virginia pine failures, and they tend to fail right at DBH height, and they tend to be of a certain size. We'll get into that in a second. The width of the columns that you see is the end. So we had a higher number of hardwood investigations that we completed versus softwoods, but that's pretty indicative of the forest cover types in Virginia. So moving on, we looked at genus. we initially had, I think it was 12 or 13 different genus that we looked at, and there were very small percentages with certain genus of trees that we decided to combine them all together. But big picture is a couple things. One is, so again, the brown is the roots, the yellow is trunk failure, and the top is branch failure. Two things jump out at me. One is that overwhelmingly, trunks, 77% were trunk failure of ash trees. Well, not surprising. About 10 years ago, I saw my first tree that had D-shaped exit wound holes. And I went, oh no. And it was by an interstate. And that was kind of the tip of the iceberg, if you will. We had an onslaught of dead ash trees that took 5 to 6 years to get through our service territory to neutralize them so that they wouldn't be causing outages, a preventive maintenance measure. But we didn't get them all, apparently. There were still quite a number of ash trees that failed, and of course they were trunk failure. The way this insect works, and I'll just show you a picture because he's so pretty. They get into the xylem, they prevent the uptake of water, and basically the tree fails at the trunk because there's just no xylem and phloem water exchange going on. Something else has surprised us. There were 2 species that jumped out in terms of branch failure. Remember, that's up at the top up there. One was yellow poplar, which does self-prune. Normally the first 2 logs, 16 feet or so, tend to be clear when it gets to a certain size. But 51% of branch failures for yellow poplar, versus when you look at the other species, and again, yellow poplar is just to the left of that other column. The other was oak. It was a lower percentage, oak and maple. Maple was 35% and oak was 27%. I don't think you can read these percentages. So again, surprising, but once again, pines, we use the genus pine as kind of an umbrella term to cover all the different pines that we looked at. Almost 67% of the failures were trunk failures. Very few were branch failures. And then oak failures in terms of roots. I just want to mention that we expected these to be much higher. Saturated soils, and just, the earth moves, right, when an oak fails at the roots. And it usually breaks poles, especially if they're of a certain size. But across the board, very fewer root failures than we expected. Usually less than 30%. Well, always less than 30%, all the way down to 16% for maple and 13% for ash, which we've already talked about. So let's move on. So we wanted to look at defects. And when I say defects, most of you are going to know what I'm talking about. And there was a slight problem though. 223 were unknown, and we started thinking about that. Why are they unknown? It's either got a defect or it doesn't. Well, if there's a tree like this that's failed, how are you going to see the bottom third of it? You can't lift it up. You can't crawl underneath. You're not going to spend the time to dig a hole to get to it to see if there's a wound or a crack or something else. So overwhelmingly, there were either no defect recorded, 389 of the 844, or it was unknown. And this is the explanation as to the unknown. Of the trees that did have defects, 89 of those were wounds. So, some kind of, either heavy equipment damage or fire scar or something that maybe became a vector for disease and decay. And that might relate to the trunk failures being prevalent across our system. Second to that was lean with 52, and then a codominant stem and cracks. So think about when you're looking at trees individually, and we're in a slightly different field because we're looking at trees at a landscape scale, but also managing them individually. We're always taught to look at wounds. We're taught to look for codominant stems and lean and all of these things, but overwhelmingly, most of the trees that failed had none of that. That matters. So, how did the defects affect failure? Well, not surprisingly, and thanks to Dr. Dahle for this great picture of not only a codominant stem and a twin, looks like white oak, with a huge wound. And, who knows what caused this? It might have been heavy equipment. It might have been construction, maybe at a park. I'm not sure where you took this. But, when you look at failures, again, roots on the bottom, trunk in the middle, branches up top. When you had none or unknown, they tended to be trunk failures across the board, right? But wound failures, 73% of those were trunk failures, and very few were branch failures. When you look at codominant stems, that branch failure percentage actually goes up to 28%. So think about that. Again, when you have a crack, not surprisingly, 75% of those were trunk failures. And some of this is just things we kind of anecdotally knew, but we didn't know it applied to utility vegetation management. Okay, so we know about, wounds. We know about genus. We know about, geographically where these were and how they failed. When did they fail? What time of the year was it? So if you look at the width of these columns, again, we're in the same roots, trunk, branches. But if you look at the width of the columns, 2 months stand out. That is August, month 8, down here at the bottom, and November, month 101. So these were all looked at by individuals, right? So, certain times of the year for utility arborists are busier than others. A lot of our job is responding to members or customers that have a question about their tree, or they want to report a tree on the line. Some of it is kind of corralling tree crews during storms and getting restoration efforts in play. Some of it's going out and auditing work that's been done to make sure it's according to our specifications. So this work was done as time permitted, as individuals had time. And in August, perhaps there were a few less storms. Same thing in November. But there's two things that stand out for me here. One is 3 months out of the year have much higher percentages of branch failure. And those are January, could be related to ice storms or snow or other failure types during winter weather. July, which would correlate nicely with summer storms and summer weather, which tend to peak in July in our service area, and September. So same thing, there tends to be more summer storms in September. August tends to be a little drier, a little hotter usually. The other thing that stands out is if you look at May, and May has a much higher percentage, 10 points more than any other month of root failures. Why is that? Well, in some cases, it might be April showers bring May flowers. And in our case, it might be April showers bring tree failures in May due to root failures. So, okay, moving right along. How are we doing for time? We need to move it along. Okay, so how does height affect failure type? So 0 to 15.2 meters, that equates to about 50 feet. if you are using feet. And the majority of our trees were 50 feet and above. Now, we did have another category that was even taller trees. We had a very low N number of those that were recorded. So we added those into the 50 and above, just kept it open. Again, most of these were trunk failures, but slightly higher branch failures in taller trees. Okay, so limitations. In January of 2022, January 3rd, to be specific, there was an ice storm to end all ice storms. And a major storm is categorized as a certain percentage of your customers out. And this was a major storm that went on for 10 days. We had 100,000 of our members out of 175,000. Huge event. We had 1,000 additional line workers that came in to help. I had 150 additional tree workers that came in to help. And even after that restoration effort was complete, it took time to take care of the widowmakers, the trees that were leaning and other trees that were just waiting to fail and knock something else down after we had already put it up and restored those folks' power. So not many records were collected during that time, as you can imagine. Actually, none in January of 22. We started back up in February, but January 22, there were no records collected. Terrain. So where you are looking right here is in Shenandoah National Park. It's a beautiful area of the country. Slopes upwards of 20% in a lot of cases. So, you know, picture folks going in to replace poles or broken insulators or cross arms, and you know, the access is difficult. It's also difficult to get in and look at a tree caused outage. Sometimes you would get out to a place and find that there were multiple trees that failed. It wasn't just one. So finding the exact tree that actually formed a carbon path, broke the pole, broke the cross arm, caused the damage was a challenge. Lack of poles or device numbers. So utilities map everything in a grid, not surprisingly. And most poles, you want to have some kind of number associated with it so you can go right to it. Our service territory is working on that. We're kind of on a 10-year process, but we haven't got all of that done yet. So finding the exact location of the tree sometimes could take a long time. So one other thing that we looked at that I didn't talk about at all today is soil type and soil moisture. And that is because they were quite subjective. We didn't do soil tests. We didn't do, you know, these are utility foresters with full-time jobs. And, you know, yes, they were collecting data as part of their job, but they had other things that were more immediate. So the soil information that we have is quite subjective. So we didn't talk about that in this presentation. We're doing some mapping with that, so stay tuned. There'll be more to talk about later with that. I wanted to mention again our subsidiary Brillet and using Power BI as a tool for tracking. So this is not last year. This is multiple years. But if you look at the number of trees outside the right-of-way that have failed and how utilities generally spend their money, and that is preventing trees from growing in or blowing in, we're not really focusing way out here as much, and we should be, because times 10, it's not tree limbs that are causing outages, it's live trees outside the right-of-way. And to a lesser extent, dead trees. So we have partnered with a firm to collect data related to percentage of chlorophyll in the leaves. And it's a satellite company. They provide a service. It's basically a layer that we pull into our work management system so that we know if there's a tree that is in decline, we can find it. And as part of our routine maintenance, we want to talk to the owner of those trees, which is never us. The utility doesn't own trees. It's property owners. And make sure that they know the why we want to take that tree down. And here's a concept. So I work for a really smart guy, and he explained this really simply many, many years ago to me. And so we've really applied that technology to this space. You remember Dr. Dahl's slide showing, if you have an outage in this zone between the substation and that first downline device, you have the biggest impact on the biggest amount of customers or members. So applying that idea to, you can't take care of every single tree that is potentially hazardous. You can't take down every possible tree that's going to impact the line. At last count, I have 7,500 miles of line. We've looked at about 4,000 of it with satellites. I had 443,000 trees that were within striking distance of the line. And of those, about 6,000 were in decline. So we're applying this technology to the HRZ. We call it the high reliability zone. And it's essentially, Cliff Notes, it's your biggest bang for your buck in terms of impact to customers or members. I'm going to turn this back over to Dr. Dahle, and then I think we might have a couple minutes for questions.
I will be very quick, so we will have at least 5 minutes for questions. I want to thank the Tree Fund and UARF for funding Cindy's in my research. And I want to thank the Tree Fund and Cindy for my future research, as well as a former graduate student, Matt Walker, who have kind of steered me back into my world of utility urban forestry. I'm in the midst of bringing on a second doctoral student who's going to help me look at tree caused outages. I saw some questions and answers about, East Coast, West Coast. We are collecting tree caused outages from utilities around the country. And the map here, as you can see, the pink states are states that I've been in conversations with gaining data, but everything that's in gray, I have a little bit of their data, the yellow a little bit more, and 50% of the states in the green. I'm trying to collect with my next graduate student as many states as possible, as thoroughly collecting in each state as possible, to try to take this idea of looking at why trees fail and cause outages from a regional approach in Virginia, which I think is great, and trying to look and see, are there regional differences? Are there national differences? And trying to understand a little bit about that. So if you got the QR code, you can click on that. You can send me an email if you work for a utility or a consulting company with a utility, if you have access to tree cause outages. I've collected over 300,000 records so far, and that's of last month, and I'm in process of trying to collect a bit more, and I'd love to hear from your utilities. This is funded by UARF, as well as I have to shout out, I didn't put it on here, the slide, American Electric Power has donated some funds towards this research as well. So I thank everyone. And Cindy, I think we're ready for the thank you slide and questions.
Yeah, one just last little plug for the team that I work with, including the puppy. They are phenomenal. They collected 99% of this data, and it's a pleasure and an honor to work with these folks and with West Virginia University and Dr. Dahle.
Cindy,
So
Dr. Dahle, thank you for a fantastic presentation. Very enlightening. I think this is great work, and it's great to see where it's headed. We do have a number of questions. I just want to, before I jump into those real quick, just remind everybody about CEUs. We will submit CEUs on your behalf directly to ISA based on the information you provided during registration. So we won't be putting up a CEU code, just as a quick reminder. Dr. Dahle, with the last few minutes, there was, I think, 2 or 3 questions that were asking in various formats about previous pruning practices, previous maintenance that occurred with these trees, if any of that was factored in when you were looking at these risk assessments and potential for failures.
So to an extent, the answer is no. Before I clarify that a little bit more, if we think about one of those slides Cindy showed, a vast majority of these tree caused outages came from outside the right-of-way that her utility actively manages. So trying to when you realize that majority of her failures, her utilities failures, are coming from outside, those are trees that are not necessarily being managed. And so the utility forester in this case, as I'm working on my other research trying to collate data, they are often just doing a quick autopsy, looking at what was the leading cause for the failure. And when the tree is on the ground, and it may be harder to understand its full history. So we didn't really take that to effect.
Thank you. There's another question here asked, I know you all were looking at species, and if you took into account, maybe fast growing trees versus slow growing trees, I guess that would be kind of almost providing some of those recommendations down the road for which trees should you be planting near, because maybe some of them have higher failure profiles than others. Was that taken into account?
Cindy, do you want to tackle that for a sec?
It's a really good point. So certainly we looked at site conditions. And again, that's going to be more kind of the mapping GIS question that's answered. When you look at species and you look at what utilities are managing, I'm just thinking of a maple at the bottom of a slope that's, in a really wet conditions, and it's growing 30 feet a year. And that's not uncommon. So, does that play into failure rates? Well, I think it did with the branch failure. We did see that. So that's a really good point. We're currently writing about this, which is apparently not my favorite thing, but I'm learning. And I'm learning that I'm really glad that there's folks that have dedicated their lives to writing research, non-technical documents, because it's not my forte. But I will say that we're looking at holistically all of these factors, and so that will be forthcoming hopefully before December.
And with that, someone else in the Q&A asked if we're going to try to write up a pamphlet. I hadn't personally thought about a pamphlet, but Cindy and I are working on a scientific article, but we also talk about, we're chatting about turning some of that, once it's published, into an article for either Arborist News and certainly for the utility newsline as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to both of you for being here. We have reached the top of the hour, so in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and bring today's webinar to a close. I can send you the rest of those questions, Dr. Dahle and Cindy, if you all want to look at those, and maybe post some answers if you should so choose whenever we post this webinar. As a reminder, everybody, this webinar was recorded. If you want to go back and rewatch it, give us a few days. It'll be posted on the treefund.org webpage under the webinars tab, so you can go back and catch up in anything you missed. And if we post any additional information, it'll be there as well. With that, thank you to both of the speakers. Thank you for Dennis to talk a little bit about the UAA and the URF grant program. So we very much appreciate everybody's participation. And we had great numbers today, even though it's election day in the United States. So thanks to everyone for taking a few minutes to join us today. So with that, we'll go ahead and bring us to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.